I'd like to turn now to the development and the origins of the war on poverty and why we have a war on poverty today. Some people alleged, particularly back in 1964, that the war on poverty got underway as some kind of a political vote-buying gimmick to buy votes in an election year. But that ignores some of the essential work and facts that had been turned up long before that election year ever came around, and in fact before President Kennedy was assassinated. The roots of the present poverty program first lie in the 1960 census data, which started to become available in 1962. And they started to tell some very interesting facts about this country, some very surprising facts, things that the analysts really hadn't expected. For instance, they showed that there were 1.5 million teenagers who were out of school and out of work. 1.5 million seems like a lot, but it's particularly a lot when it was twice as many as there were the year before. It had doubled in 1 year. It showed that Negroes were living better in 1960 than they were in 1950. But the fact was that whites were living a lot better in 1960 than they were in 1950, and that the relative income of the Negroes had fallen with respect to whites. They were not catching up, they were falling further and further behind, relatively. It showed that there were other areas of the country where poor people were concentrated, which were being left behind, which were almost untouched by the economic growth of the 1950s and by the economic growth of the early 1960s. Further analyses carried out by the Census Bureau, for instance, show that in the Watts area of Los Angeles, between 1960 and 1965, personal income fell, relatively and absolutely. There were more broken homes in Watts in 1965 than there were in 1960. Unemployment was higher. Welfare checks and the number of welfare recipients was higher in 1965 than it was in 1960. And segregation was greater in 1965 than it was in 1960. They started to show some of the data about Negroes in the South, particularly Negro sharecroppers, who were being thrown out of work, who know little except picking cotton on southern plantations, and that job simply doesn't exist any longer. They're being thrown not only out of work, but out of their homes in many cases, with no education, no background, no place to go. It also showed some surprising things about the pure price of discrimination in this country. For instance, the fact that a Negro college graduate can expect to earn the same during his lifetime as a white who has never gone beyond the 8th grade. The pure price of discrimination in this country. The analysts got disturbed at what many of these facts showed. And particularly among those who were disturbed was the Council of Economic Advisors, which at that time was working for President Kennedy. And they placed before him some proposals, some facts, some analyses, which indicated that a poverty program was needed in this country because there were problems which simply weren't being faced up to. There were places where progress was needed, where no progress was being made. So that in early November, mid-November, President Kennedy had on his desk in 1963 a series of proposals concerning a poverty program. And these were one of the first things that President Johnson saw when he took over. And it was on the basis of these proposals that he made the statement in his State of the Union address in January 1964 concerning the declaration of unconditional war on poverty. These are the true roots of the war on poverty. And it was at that time that Sergeant Shriver was asked to take over the planning and the leadership of this program. The program was passed during the next 6 months by Congress, and there are certain basic kinds of philosophies which are absolutely critical to understanding what the war on poverty is all about. Most fundamental of these is that the war on poverty is concerned with solutions, not with simply alleviating some of the symptoms of poverty. We're not interested in aspirin tablets. We're interested in ways to cure the disease. Everything that we do aims at attacking causes of poverty to the greatest extent that we can. And the programs that have been developed are aimed particularly at attacking what local people see, what the federal government sees, what state government sees as fundamental causes of poverty. We evaluate what we do not on the basis of number of hours taught or anything like that, but by the number of people who get out of poverty. The second major pillar underneath the poverty program is that it relies to a tremendous amount on local initiative. Community action programs, neighborhood youth corps grants, other kinds of programs which were passed by Congress all require local applications. They are not programs which are delivered to local communities on some silver platter by federal bureaucrats. In fact, it requires a tremendous amount of effort at the local level, and those of you who have been working over the past 2 years realize this well. This is both a strength and a weakness of the poverty program. A strength because we are still convinced that local people understand causes of poverty better than any bureaucrats sitting in offices in Washington. But as a weakness as well, because it means that where poverty is concentrated most, you find the resources fewest as well to analyze the causes of poverty and to try to bring programs which will do something about those fundamental causes of poverty. We still have problems, for instance, in getting intensive programs into rural areas, in the South particularly, onto Indian reservations, in the southwestern part of the United States. So that this local initiative is terribly important. Thirdly, the poverty program didn't adopt one single approach to the elimination of poverty. As a matter of fact, the analysts who participated in developing the program were convinced that poverty is more than anything else the result of a very complex web of causes, and that it cannot be simply an educational program, nor can it be simply a health program, nor can it be simply a family counseling program, but it has to be lots of things at the same time, all together, and all working together. And it's designed to try to bring these multiple kinds of approaches together at the same time, at the point where they are needed most. Community action program, for instance, is aimed at providing the kind of coordinated work together by health and welfare councils, by school boards, by local hospitals, by local churches, by social work units, by welfare departments together, not separately, not saying, for instance, the school systems have the final answer to poverty, or that the welfare departments have the final answer to poverty, because clearly no one place, no one institution, no one set of workers has this final answer. Fourthly, we constructed the program so that we deal with a variety of different institutions. We deal with schools, we deal with colleges, we deal with universities, but we also deal with churches. We have labor unions, for instance, which are running Head Start projects. We have in Job Corps centers operated directly by the federal government, Job Corps centers operated by businesses, some operated by school boards, some operated by universities. And in each case, we've gone to those institutions which seem to have not only the will, but also the know-how to bring something new to those particular projects. We designed the program so that it could be operated through not only using multiple approaches, but using a variety of different kinds of institutions. And fifthly, we also designed the program so that we could bring into play new recruits, you might say, in the war on poverty. Now, there are a great many organizations that have for decades been in the vanguard of the fight for the war on poverty. Welfare departments, school boards in many cases, health and welfare councils, social workers are whole veterans of the poverty war. But we were convinced that if we were going to win this fight, we would need new forces. And therefore we constructed it so that we would be able to look to new kinds of allies. And they have, in fact, been forthcoming. And they've come from very interesting sectors. The American Bar Association, for instance, which up until 2 years ago really never felt that it had a role in the war on poverty, is now endorsing, and their local chapters are helping to operate legal services projects in communities all across this country. They're a new ally. Even allies like, for instance, the American Bankers Association have come to us. And only 3 weeks ago, we got a letter from the American Medical Association wanting to know what they could do to help in the war on poverty. And with their help, we look forward to a major new program shortly of health centers to be located in slum communities all across this country. The American Legion has been a major factor in helping us to recruit people for Head Start. In looking back over the last 18 months to 2 years of the war on poverty, there's been a great deal of controversy and a great deal of criticism of what has been done. Some of it is justified, some of it is not justified. But I think that regardless of what has been done by the Office of Economic Opportunity or the federal government, that the war on poverty has achieved one great result, and that is that there is an awareness, a conscious awareness across this country of poverty problems that simply did not exist 2 or 2.5 years ago. A couple of years ago, you could have called a conference on poverty and held it in a telephone booth in most communities in this country. Today, a poverty conference is called, and you have to hire the largest hall in town. You have an overflow crowd, and there are pickets outside, and then there are pickets picketing the picketers. So that there is an awareness of poverty that simply didn't exist. Project Head Start last summer, for instance, had 250,000 volunteers who worked for nothing to help that program get off the ground. 250,000 volunteers. The Domestic Peace Corps has 60,000 applicants wanting to get into it today. Across the country, there is, in fact, a kind of a growing awareness as well as an unleashing of social forces that is terribly important and that has to be tabled up as the major success of the war on poverty today. Not to minimize the success of things like Project Head Start, of the Job Corps, of the Neighborhood Youth Corps, of what local communities have done, but the most important thing for all of us is the fact that this country is committed to do something about this problem now, and with that kind of support, we can move ahead far more rapidly than we could ever have thought of 2 years ago. Now, I would like to turn to Stan Salette, the director of the Education Division of Community Action Programs in Washington, and have him talk a little bit about the development of education programs within this overall poverty framework.
I think if you applied a slide rule to the Office of Economic Opportunities programs and try to measure them in terms of educational services, health services, welfare services, you'd find that education was a very large majority percentage of the programs. You find education in the Neighborhood Youth Corps, in the Job Corps, in Head Start, in Upward Bound, in legal aid education, in small business education, in fact, in most of the programs of OEO. If one looked again at where there was perhaps in the intent of Congress the greatest controversy, one would have to look, I think, to the Community Action Program. There, in the language of the legislation, you will find mention of many possible programs that a community could undertake. And here, I think the intent was that there was no real answer to poverty nationally. There was no one approach that could be taken. And I think, just as the Office of Economic Opportunities programs at large, no one approach, in fact, was taken by all the communities in the United States. So as you read the legislation, you see mention of job training, of health programs, of social services. But when it comes to education, you do not find the word education in Title IIA, the Community Action Program. You find the words special, remedial, and non-curricular assistance. Now this was done for a very specific reason. It was felt, as the program passed through Congress, that a general aid to education program, because of the church-state issue, was impossible. As many of you probably know, the federal government had up until this time been unable to pass major educational aid legislation because primarily of the church-state issue. So this language was formed to try to get away from what we termed general aid to education. And so the programs developed from this language could not be really part of the regular school curriculum. They could be associated with it. As programmers in Washington, we felt generally that this language allowed the general run of what educators call compensatory education programs. And so in the first year of operation, we operated preschool programs, remedial education programs, summer school programs, after-school study centers, tutorial projects, recreation programs, and all sorts of other specialized classes. I think one measure of the importance that education had in the first year of operation is told by the statistic that over 50% of all the community action monies that went into projects during the first fiscal year went for education. I think in retrospect, the community action effort in education has led the way for much larger federal inputs of funds through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, through the Higher Education Act. We feel, perhaps proudly, that we're in the business first and saw the need first and perhaps pointed the way for Congress first. But now with the inputs of this additional money, which is more than additional, when we're talking about $1 billion, it dwarfs our aid, I think here the intent of the original legislation comes back to us again. And this is that community action programs were not seen as any particular projects, not primarily Head Start or Upward Bound or job training, but really as gap fillers. Community action monies are seen as meeting local needs, but also linking very heavily to other federal, state, and local funds. And in the coming years, with the added input of Office of Education funds, I think our funds would probably tend not to be as heavy in education and tend to go into other areas, other program areas, perhaps health, perhaps job training, where federal funds are not as sufficient as they are in education. But again, the intent is important here. The intent of a gap filler, the intent of a community action agency as a mobilizing resource, as a coordinating agency.
I think there's another important aspect of the existence of the Office of Economic Opportunity which is often overlooked, and that is the fact that one thing that has been created at the federal level and recreated through the programs which have been sponsored by the Office of Economic Opportunity, recreated at the local level, is the coming into existence of a series of offices and agencies which are concerned solely and exclusively with the problems of poor people broadly conceived, not with the educational problems of poor people or with the health problems of poor people, but with all the problems of poor people and only the problems of poor people. At the federal level, as you know, the agencies of government are organized vertically generally. We have an Office of Education, and we have a Public Health Service, we have a Department of Commerce, we have a Department of Labor, and each one of those is concerned with all the problems that affect that particular field of activity. The Office of Education is concerned not only with the kind of education that poor people get, but whether we have enough PhDs in various kinds of fields. The Department of Agriculture is concerned not only with the problems of the poor rural farmer, but the problems of price supports, and those as they're related to the largest and most automated kinds of farms. The new innovation at the federal level is the stationing of an individual, in this case Sergeant Shriver, the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, located in the executive office of the President, who is concerned solely and exclusively with the problems of poor people and with developing programs and coordinating the efforts of the federal government towards doing something about the problems of this large segment of our population. Today, nearly 20%. This is a tremendous new innovation, really without historical precedent. And the recreation through, for instance, community action programs at the local level, which are concerned with problems of poor people in their community, has been significant across this entire country. One thing that we find is that the secondary effects, the wave effects of this on various kinds of institutions throughout the country are things that we neither could have foreseen nor could have planned for, even if we could perhaps have foreseen them. For instance, I was talking recently to some educators in the teaching field who indicate that the number of teachers going into teachers' colleges now who are concerned, who indicate a concern with teaching disadvantaged children is 5 times as great as it was 3 years ago. This is a change in the structure of the school system, which is going to have tremendous effects, not only on the kinds of educational programs, but on what happens to the students. Job Corps, Bob Randolph, who is director of assignment and recruitment of Job Corps enrollees, for instance. Job Corps has had some tremendously innovative effects on the relationships and the involvement of business. Perhaps you'd like to mention that.
Well, the purposes of Job Corps today are the same as they were in the beginning, to provide a residential training program for poor youth, men and women 16 to 21. And recognizing that the needs of poor youth are varied in terms of their needs as well as their aspirations, the persons who plan this program, as well as those who operate on the headquarters staff today, felt and still do feel that many approaches are necessary. That not just the approaches that we're all accustomed to in terms of the educator and who he is, but the resources and the ideas and the skills, you might say, of business firms. This does not mean that Job Corps was then and still is today simply tied to getting a job. But there were knowledges and skills within business firms, as well as the interests, surprisingly, in many business firms, to try to do something for poor youth. And so in 2 kinds of centers that we're operating, business firms are doing creative jobs in terms of thousands of American poor youth. We have 9 centers operated exclusively for women today, of which many business firms that I could name either are basic or subcontractors in terms of many parts of the operations of these centers. We have 8 men's urban centers that take populations of from 1,000 to 3,000 poor youth, who are to a large extent operated by major business firms. I think this is one of the most creative things I think that we can witness, to see major names in American business working hand in hand with the federal government and with the traditional educator, cooperatively on a day-by-day basis, to bring another hope, you might say, a second chance to these poor youth.
Bob Christen, who is the director of the Institute for Services to Education, has been working in depth with colleges and universities who are interested in the problems of taking young men and women who have come out of poverty backgrounds and who have therefore often not had high aspirations, and raising those aspirations so that they can perhaps look forward to going to college. You've had a terrific advantage point to look at what's happening in colleges and universities today, Bob.
I think the biggest thing about this year when this program became national was the response that we received from colleges and universities to indicate that they are willing to be involved in the war on poverty. In this unprecedented educational program, which brings together college and secondary school teachers, undergraduate and graduate students, and non-professionals on the same staff to work on college campuses or in some of the secondary schools with residential facilities to try to provide motivation for young people who are not motivated mainly because of their poverty, to give them a chance to prepare themselves for choices for some kind of post-secondary education, which may be college and may not. The success of last year's pilot projects indicates here that there is a great deal that can be done, and the successes last year were quite dramatic enough that Sergeant Shriver believed this was a good program because it represented the possibility of taking these young people out of poverty permanently over a long, long period of time, one of the most economical.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of the successes that were achieved and how the universities worked with the schools last summer on some of these projects?
One of the successes, and we can't judge this yet, is that large numbers or a large percentage of the students that were in programs last year who had graduated from 12th grade went to college and are still in college. It's too early to make any kind of prediction or to take that into account until we see what happens afterwards. But I think from those who observed, those who went around last summer and saw these programs, it was to see the excitement that was there. It was to see at the beginning of a program the young man who came into a class in Oregon, and he sat in the back of the classroom, and he left his hat on, and he turned his chair all the way around so he was facing the back wall with his back to the teacher. And the teacher paid no attention to this, and he sat that way for the whole first week of class. Sometime toward the end of the second week of class, he moved his chair a little bit farther toward the teacher, and you know the end of the story. By the end of the summer session, his chair was all the way around, the hat was off, he was turned on, he was involved in this program. There were stories like that in many of the programs.
What about Project Head Start? This is Dick Orton, who is the staff director of Project Head Start in Washington, D.C. That's had an effect on many of the school systems, particularly in how they're coming in for Elementary and Secondary Education Act funds, as I understand it.
The effect of Head Start, Chris, has been quite significant, we think, in a number of ways. I think that, well, I can just list them very quickly without necessarily giving them one emphasis or another. The use of sub-professionals in the classroom, I think, is an innovation, a change in the traditional way of education that has really caught fire. We have innumerable stories of persons who have, teachers who were involved last summer, who went back after being involved in a classroom with 15 children and 2 aides, and going back to a situation where she had to face 40 children. She demanded some aides, and in many communities has gotten them. The ratio of 15 to 1 was a significant improvement. But I think probably the most dramatic thing that we would like to see sustained is the degree of parental and community involvement. We have gotten parents of the poor interested. We have stimulated them. And this, I think, is the thing that must be sustained in the future if, again, we are to retain the benefits of Head Start.